Thank you. And tonight going to talk about a project that I've been working on since 2016, which is the Church of Holy Trinity, Minchinhampton in Gloucestershire in the Cotswolds, where there's been a major reordering and there's ongoing work. And I just want to run through some of that really tonight and just pick out some of the highlights of that. So if you can all see this inset in the bottom left-hand corner, it's a map of part of the southwest of England. So Minchinhampton is kind of halfway between Gloucester and Bristol, up on the Cotswold plateau, overlooking, well, just above Stroud. And the right-hand plan is the first edition Ordnance Survey. And the church is a black building up on the edge of the common and on the edge of the marketplace. And Minchinhampton is well, is it a town or is it a village? It has had a market, but it's a matter of some debate amongst locals.
Anyone can hear us.
Hello, sorry. Oh, sorry, I thought someone was saying so. Anyway, so the church is in an absolutely fantastic setting above the marketplace. There's a lovely old postcard from the Harward beard collection showing the children are all in the marketplace with the church behind, and you can see that it sits up above the marketplace there. So there's been a church at Minchinhampton since we know there was a Norman church. Minchinhampton, or Hampton as it was called, is mentioned in the Domesday survey, and there is a reference to a priest but not to a church. There's no evidence for a Saxon church, and indeed there's no standing evidence for any of the Norman building, but we do know that it was there, as you'll see in a minute. The church is broadly cruciform in shape, with nave and aisles, tower, two transepts, chancel, and it has this lovely octagonal porch room built at the west end in the 1970s, which provides a lot of the kind of more necessary functions of toilet and meeting room and everything. The church as it stands today is a product of several phases of work, largely decorated early 14th century, and then a major rebuilding in 1842. Those are two of the phases that we'll really be talking about today in the development of this church. Now, as with many churches, it has suffered in the past from damp and being quite cold, and not being a particularly a good environment for the congregation and for the wider community to use. And at the start of the millennium, it was realised that something needed to be done for the conservation of the building, and that resulted in a consultation and research towards a reordering in order to bring the church up to spec for modern uses. And that reordering was led by a team from the church, and also by the architect Anthony Feltham King from St Anne's Gate in Salisbury. And I was appointed as the archaeologist and have worked on the project ever since. The reordering was largely the greatest impact was to install underfloor heating, and the evaluation test pits demonstrated that the Victorian restoration or rebuilding had removed most of the or nearly all of the medieval strata within most of the church. So we knew that we had a fairly, there was a fairly limited impact on archaeological strata because the Victorians had hacked it all away. So that was good because it gave us our space for the build-up for the underfloor heating. and the nave and aisles were going to be raised up to match the level of the chancel in order to create a more accessible space with a slightly ramped narthex. And there were some other works which were more to do with the internal space and the views into the chancel from the nave. A screen by FC Eden was moved from the crossing, from the west side of the crossing to the south side of the crossing, and the pews were replaced by chairs. And the photograph shows some of the workmen that I worked with excavating the rubble, and the walls that you can see there supported the wooden sleeper, the wooden pew platforms of the church. And underneath all of that, as I say, most of the medieval strata had been stripped off, but there was still quite a bit of archaeology. But generally, we could leave that in place, and we could clean back and record without having to excavate. And that meant that, fortunately, inside the church, although there were many graves there and many tombs there, we only had to excavate one burial, which is a good result as far as I'm concerned. So what do we know about...
Well, can you go onto that arrow and see what comes up?
I think someone probably wants to mute themselves. Okay. So what do we know, and how do we know it, of Holy Trinity across the centuries? One of the reasons why we know so much about Holy Trinity is down to one man, and that is a gentleman called Fenning Park. Well, actually, he's not a gentleman. He was a lowly schoolmaster and parish clerk, and he became a local historian. He was born in London, and he moved to Minchinhampton to become the schoolmaster for the new school in the early 19th century when he was very young. And he was absolutely passionate about local history and was instrumental in preserving many documents which otherwise would never have made it into the archives in Gloucester Records Office. And those include some key documents which could very easily have been lost, including an absolutely fantastic letter by one William Shepstone, builder, who wrote not only did he build the new church, he wasn't the architect, but he was the builder, and he was a very educated man when it came to church archaeology. He understood the Thomas Rickman's, fairly recent in 1841, kind of phases of Gothic and early English and decorated, etc. And he knew his architecture, he understood his buildings, and he not only built the new building, but he took it down as well. He was responsible for demolishing a lot, and he actually recorded in writing descriptions of much of the fabric that he demolished. And that's really important because that's the only evidence that we have for much of that fabric. He also refers to sketches that he made, and it is highly likely that some of the fragments of architectural mouldings and the like were retained, but sadly those have all been lost. If we could find Shepstone's sketches, that would be absolutely fantastic, but the odds are rather slim. So it's down to, we've got some written evidence, eyewitness evidence from the demolition of the medieval church. We also obviously have the archaeological evidence talked about a bit. We have architectural details, both in the standing parts of the medieval church which remain, and excavated architectural details, many of which were studied by Dr. James Wright of Triskelly, and who wrote all of those up for us. And we're also lucky enough to have the late John Cannon look at the south transept. So as well as those, we have a very good set of churchwardens accounts dating from 1555. We have parish records, we have vestry minutes, We have plans which were produced by Fenning Park, the schoolmaster, immediately before the demolition of the nave and the aisles. And they give us the layout of the pews, but they also do things like show us where the surviving Norman columns were. We have the letter from the builder William Shepstone describing the old church. We have an architectural assessment by the Victorian Gothic revivalist architect William Burgess, who was rather disparaging about Foster's work. And we have various papers and books by local historians, as well as a lot of paintings, engravings, and latterly photographs. So we have a good mix of evidence, and all of that material has been brought together to try and weave the history of the development of Holy Trinity. So there's nothing of the Norman church surviving above ground. And we have very little evidence for the Norman church beside the written record of William Shepstone and the plans of the North Arcade by Fenning Park. But we do know that the church had a nave. Because it had an arcade, it clearly had a north aisle. It may well have had a chapel on the north side of the tower and chancel at the east. We don't know if it had a south aisle or a south kind of transept, but this is a fairly standard arrangement for a Cotswold Norman church. We did find some fragments of Norman column drum, and the Shepstone describes chevron moulding and the like found up in the clerestory above the north arcade, some of which was reused, which suggests that there could have been two phases of Norman work there. We can look very closely for an idea of what it would have looked like at Avening Church, which is only a couple of miles away, and was actually held by the same institution who held the manor of Minchinhampton. William the Conqueror gave Minchinhampton and Avening to the abbess of the Abbey aux Dames in Caen, in Normandy, in France. So they had an absentee landlord in France, but it's likely that the church at Avening, the same masons may well have worked on that. And this is an example of the north door with later insert below the tympanum and the plan of Avening Church. Avening Church, absolutely fantastic, well worth a visit as well if you're in the area. So we have tantalising glimpses of the Norman. The early English, we know that there are some windows put into the chancel and probably a new east window with lancets at the east end of the chancel, but very little else is known. We know there's a Lady Chapel from 1300. When we start to have real evidence is in the early 14th century with the almost complete rebuilding of the whole church. All of the church is rebuilt, save the north aisle. And the north aisle was actually used by the people of Rodborough, which is a small, now it's a kind of suburb, I guess, part of Stroud, but then was a small settlement within the parish of Minchinhampton, and it was separate, and it had its own chapel at Ease, St Mary's, from 1316. It's possible they would have been responsible for the upkeep of their own aisle, and it's possible that they didn't have quite the enthusiasm for rebuilding it when they were busy creating their own chapel of Ease at the same time. But effectively, the whole of the church gets rebuilt over probably about 20, 30 years in the early 14th century. And we have a engraving by H.E. Relton, which shows the church largely as it was in the mid 14th century, with a few details of later accretions. But the bulk of the church was early 14th century. So here you can see a ground plan of the decorated church, where we have some excavated remains, and the dates of the chancel. Documentary evidence for a great altar suggests that was consecrated in 1315. That may have been before or after the complete rebuilding of the tower, which has a tiercel vault and a octagonal brooch spire. The south transept appears to have been completed in 1330, the north transept in 1338, and the nave and aisles potentially sometime after that. There's also a porch. So the north aisle is the only bit retained. So you can see it's a massive, massive undertaking. It would have been a huge investment by what appear to be several different benefactors. The architectural detailing that we can see that survives and the clues that we have suggest that there are different patrons and different masons working. It's not a unified plan. It does not appear to have been instigated by the abbess in Caen, because this is during the period of the 100 Years' War, when Minchinhampton, as a foreign estate, was forfeited to the crown. So the abbess had nothing to do with the manor and the church at this time. This is a rather delightful watercolor from the early 19th century with a manor house in the right-hand side. And there's just some tantalising glimpses, very oblique glimpse of the chancel east window, with possibly with a sexfoil above 5 lights there. So we get some little glimpses from these early illustrations. This is one of the only surviving chancel window that we have. This was actually reconstructed and rebuilt after the chancel was demolished by Foster. This is the only bit of restoration, conservation work that he did really in putting this back in the new chancel. We do have some other clues. So in the top left corner is part of a piece of tracery from a window that we can reconstruct into this form, possibly from the nave, possibly from the chancel. And the bottom two are in the middle. There's a simplified version. These are limestone slabs which have been inscribed with a grid of baselines called ad triangulum, and it's a technique for laying out geometry for tracery. And on the right-hand side of the screen is a tentative reconstruction of the tracery that is formed by this. And it's it was an absolutely fabulous find to get. It's at 1-to-1 scale as well. So this could have been the workings out of the master mason of his tracery designs, or potentially for cutting templates from leather for taking onto the banker to make up the templates for cutting the stone. Internally, we have some evidence for decoration. We have this nice crocketed pinnacle, and we also have the top of on the right-hand side is the top of an ogee arched kind of wall niche tomb, possibly that which is known to have been in the chancel, and again early 14th century. So the south transept, completed probably 1330. William Burgess, who knew a thing or two, said that it was one of the most perfect and curious specimens of the architecture of the middle of the 14th century. David Veery, equally glowing in his praise, as is pretty much everyone. It's an absolutely fantastic overlooked gem of a structure. That wheel window is just absolutely fabulous, and it's really well worth a visit. The side of the chapel is equally impressive with, in John Cannon's words, the tight rhythm of 2 light windows and buttresses. It gives this very deep, sunken effect on the building and on the view of it. Although the wheel window has been slightly altered later in the 19th century, it's largely original. And there's a project to look at the conserving the glass and the stone on this coming up soon. On the inside, the glass is by Hardman. It's extremely faded. Technical problems that beset 19th century glassmaking mean that a lot of the detail has lost, but it's still, you know, absolutely glorious. You can start to see in the roof space that these are stone ribs, and yes, and John Cannon has identified the kind of the model for the wheel window in Old St Paul's in London, and he as part of the book that we've written about Minchinhampton Church has linked the West Country decorated style coming from linking that with Old St Paul's and masons coming from London, as we know, to the West Country, but also intriguingly links to East Anglia as well. So this is an engraving from the builder. And you can see here again the kind of scissor ribs with these mandalas and kind of those. And this is the nearest parallel, which is actually in Cambridgeshire, which seems a very long way away. And is it just chance, or is it just two masons completely independently coming to the same solution for a stone vault? Or is it potentially they're working from a similar model that's now lost? There are links between East Anglia and the West Country and between buildings in the two places. So have we got masons moving across the country here? But it's absolutely fantastic. Who was this transept for? It's a chantry. We have records of chantry bequests. But there's been a long confusion over who the inhabitants of these two niches are. Are they Peter de la Mare? Is it Peter de la Mare's son, Robert? Or is it John Ansley, also known as Anslow, Andros, Andelays, Ansleys, sometimes morphing into St. Chloe? It's really difficult to get a handle on the spelling. It moves around a lot, which makes things a lot harder. What makes it harder still to understand which of these wealthy inhabitants gave the bequest for the chantry where they are buried is the fact that on the effigy of the knight there is an eagle displayed. That unfortunately is the emblem of the de la Mares, but also of the Ansleys. And there was a tile pavement in the south transept which included eagle displayed tiles. What's more confusing still is that John Ansley married Peter de la Mare's widow. So it's all a bit confusing, but essentially these two the two people are in fact John and Lucy of Ansley, and they're buried there in this wonderful monument side by side. In the north transept, slightly more dialed down decoration. However, we do have another niche, and this is probably in 1842, William Shepstone records that a stone coffin was found here, and it contained a skeleton of a man with the remains of vestments and boots. And it is possible that this is William of Prestbury, who was the priest and who endowed a chantry in 1338 in the north transept. The north transept had been, we know that there was a lady chapel there from 1300. We know the first chantry was there in 1316. And we know that there was an altar there. as is needed for chantries, obviously, because Shepstone again records that there were two statue niches on either side of where the altar would have been, and those had been defaced, presumably at the Reformation, and covered over, but they were quite ornate, decorated niches. Also in the North Transept are probably chantries from local wealthy family, the Hamptons. Minchinhampton was known as Hampton in the medieval until relatively recent, still is known as Hampton by many people. John Hampton and his wife Ellen in the 1460s. Down below are all of his children, one of whom is Alice, later Dame Alice de Hampton, who became a nun at Sion Abbey later, and who donated a bell in 1515, which now, after a long journey around Minchinhampton in various buildings, is back at the church and is used to ring for communion. That's the medieval church. So you have a church which is being rebuilt in the early years of the 14th century, just before the Black Death. That's not something that really happens in Gloucestershire, in the Cotswolds. I think there's only one fully decorated church in the Gloucestershire Cotswolds. Generally, you just have a bit of new windows, spires going up, but this isn't a church which is happening as part of a wider movement, such as the later the wool churches, for example. So this is very much a one-off and is therefore especially important in Gloucestershire and West Country architecture. By the Reformation, the church was pretty much complete and hadn't been changed a huge amount. Bit of an additional clerestory. The main changes of the Reformation were obviously liturgical and in terms of the people and the practices within the church. And this is where the churchwardens' accounts really come into their own. And it is through the very mundane items of expenditure which are recorded meticulously in the churchwardens' accounts that we can construct how the parish and how the church dealt with the pendulum swing between Catholicism and Protestantism. The churchwardens' accounts start in the time of Queen Mary and then go through to Elizabeth, and it appears that the parish was not particularly keen on Protestantism. They were very ready to order new statues of the Virgin Mary and the Trinity when Mary was in. Lots of candles, lots of frankincense, and the Easter Sepulchre came back, and all of these are recorded. When Elizabeth comes in, it swings the other way, and the entries are often for books of common prayer, which they seem to lose quite regularly, homilies, and items such as Erasmus, paraphrases. And there are also entries which describe how the interior of the church would have looked. There's an entry in the late 16th century which describes the well-named Adam Painter, who was paid to paint the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, and other orders on the church walls. So medieval wall paintings would have been whitewashed over, and new black text would have been written and painted on there. And while we were excavating the very top of a medieval tomb, which had been reused in the 18th century, we actually found some of these fragments of black letter text, as it's known. And we can date this text because it's in English. We have the fawn, and we have a comma, and we also have the letter Z. Now, because we have the letter Z, we know it's not the Ten Commandments because there isn't a Z in the Ten Commandments. So it may be one of these other orders. So are these the parts of the paintings that Adam Painter did on the walls, and then were hacked off at some later point, probably to put a memorial onto the wall, to fix the memorial onto the masonry, um, and the fragments of plaster were thrown into the pit. There was more plaster in the pit. It's a jigsaw puzzle where we only have a few of the pieces. Most of the pieces are still in the tomb, but because we weren't excavating below that level, we've left them there. But it was an intriguing jigsaw puzzle to try and fit together. Other references in the churchwarden's accounts that are particularly noteworthy are there's a reference to taking out the woman from the porch, which is probably a statue of the Virgin Mary, and that's relatively late, again in the Elizabethan period. They seem to be, and that's tied into a new incumbent who is particularly zealous in his Protestantism. Other things happening in the 16th century, the spire. The one thing everyone knows about Minchinhampton locally, church, is that the spire is truncated. It's got a coronet on top. And there's been lots of debate about when that happened, because there are lots of entries in the churchwarden's accounts about items to do with the tower and the spire and lead work, for example. Surveys were made, people were sent for, masons were sent for to come and inspect the tower. They clearly had a lot of problems with it, but it looks like in 1563 the tower was taken down, and the coronet was put on top with the pinnacles. It's not alone in being truncated spires in Gloucestershire. There's a couple in Gloucester to start with. There is, just going back, there is a local legend that the parish of Minchinhampton were in a race with the neighbouring parish of Bisley as to who could complete their spire first, and the people of Minchinhampton cheated by not finishing it. But that seems rather spurious, to say the least. Burials and memorials. There was quite a bit of archaeological evidence for these, including some of the medieval cross slabs you can see on the left, which were found, many of which were found in 1842, reused within the 14th century walls of the nave, but also later memorials and monuments as well. And there's a really good cross section of monuments, not only in the churchyard but also inside the church in the narthex, and most of those are in stone. The latest one was found just behind the organ, where it had been hidden for over 100 years, and that was of Anne Bainham, who died in 1633, and she was aged less than 30 days when she died. However, she received this rather fantastically executed effigy and monument, which is quite touching in a time, obviously, when there was a lot of infant mortality. And that monument is being recorded later this week and will be fixed in the narthex of the church for everyone to see, so that it's not hidden behind the organ. In terms of excavated evidence, we only had one burial that we excavated inside, but external works we excavated quite a few. But we did find a lot of grave furniture, coffin handles, or grips as they're properly called. Lots of these on the left were local blacksmith products. In the centre were cast products, which were probably made in Birmingham or London and would be ordered from a catalogue. And the top right is something called coffin lace, and that is applied a kind of relief embossed strip, which is applied to the edges of the coffin to help fix down the cloth which would have covered coffins of that period. We also had some of the quite common actually 18th century cherub escutcheon plates, and there's a rather rusty example as well as page from the catalogue. In the post-medieval period into the 18th century, the view by Kipps of the church still largely in its 14th century form, but you can see that there are a couple of external stairs, one on the west wall and one on the south wall, because we're starting to get a lot of galleries and box pews inside the church. This is a plan by Fenning Park of the church in 1841, 1842, which shows all of the first floor galleries. And you have the West Gallery, you have a Northern Gallery, you have a gallery in the North Transept, gallery in the South Aisle, North Aisle, South Transept. But you also have a gallery in the chancel, because the focus of attention in the church of this period was not the altar, it was actually the pulpit and the word. It was the church as an auditorium. And each of these galleries would have been entered normally by an external stair. There were some internal stairs as well. It's a lovely engraving of the church before, and again you can see a couple of the external stairs, one running up the side of the south transept, and in the middle of the south transept roof you can see a chimney for a small stove or fireplace for keeping the inhabitants of some of the box pews warm. By the 1830s, Holy Trinity was probably about 800 years old, and unsurprisingly was not in a particularly great condition. There was a general consensus that lots of repairs needed to be done, and lots of repairs were done. However, there appears to have been a bit of a block in the aging curate William Cocken, because it was only a few weeks, 3 or 4 weeks after his death, that the church was actually the decision was made to be rebuilt. And the rebuilding was largely funded by a gentleman called David Ricardo, who was the son of David Ricardo, who was a extremely wealthy speculator and sometime MP who had moved from London to escape the anger of the people who thought that he had wagered on the result, speculated on the result of the Battle of Waterloo to make his millions. And he's a father of certain capitalist theories. He was quite a local benefactor. His son David Jr. was a real philanthropist and bestowed quite a lot of money to various institutions in Minchinhampton, and also built several other churches in the area, including 2 in the parish, which was subdivided. The church felt at this time under threat from nonconformists, but also from radicals, and there was quite a bit of dissent in the town, particularly about the church rate which needed to be paid. So it was quite contentious to have a major rebuilding project. But once William Cocken had died, Ricardo pushed this through within a matter of weeks, and the church was substantially rebuilt over the next year. And this is an oil painting of the church, which was designed by Thomas Foster, who designed several churches in the Stroud area. It's the nave and aisles were completely demolished and rebuilt. The chancel was completely demolished and rebuilt, with only that one window saved and reassembled. The south transept, with its glorious wheel window, was down to be demolished, but was saved by a mill owner in Nailsworth, who was a local antiquarian, and protested and had sufficient weight to persuade Ricardo that it should be kept. So this is the church as we have it really now. It's a medieval transepts and tower with Victorian nave and chancels. And part of this rebuilding in 1842 included quite a sophisticated water management system. The water from the northern set of roofs on the nave and aisles ran down into and filled a large tank underneath the sacristy, but also the remaining water from there ran underneath the nave and exited on the south side, the downhill side of the nave. Unfortunately, it crossed an area where there were lots of graves and it collapsed. The side of this drain was formed out of bits of rubble, including lots of architectural fragments, which were extremely informative, and it collapsed into the loose ground of the graves underneath, with the result that all of the water, whenever it rained, all the water basically came into the church, and that was one of the reasons why Holy Trinity suffered from the damp. Lots of pews, Victorian church, as expected, and galleries. So this is still, the Gothic revival hadn't really hit Minchinhampton by this point, and we're still looking really at a church as an auditorium rather than a Gothic revival building. That would come with the engagement of renowned architect and designer William Burgess in 1869, who was brought in to give a bit of vavavoom to the east end of the church. And he designed this double pane east window with two sets of tracery echoing the wheel window. It's hard to outshine the south transept wheel window, but he did a very good job on that. The glass is by Hardman, and he got Hardman and Co. to put the glass in on the south transept as well. Unfortunately, it hasn't aged well, and there's a lot of ghosting, but it still looks absolutely splendid despite the loss of detail. In the 20th century, FC Eden left his mark on the church. Burgess's chancel was painted, and he was called in, again, very high church, to put in a rood and a new rood screen. Originally, that was obviously in its classic position. As part of the reordering, that was moved over to the south side. The rood stayed in place. It's the detail of the work. Eden wanted to paint this, but the locals refused and wouldn't let him, and kept it as oak. And then in the 1970s, facilities were added in the form of the porch room, which is octagonal and based on the octagonal is inspired by apparently by a traditional Tanzanian house, which was inspired by the links between the incumbent at the time who had done ministry over there, and that's been updated since. And so the latest work has been by Anthony Felton King at St Anne's Gate, and the next work is on. So the organ is currently being cleaned and will be reinstalled, and it's absolutely fantastic. And the next project will be on the south transept and the stained glass. So looking forward to seeing what more we can learn about the building from that. Working on this building over the last nearly 10 years, 9 years, has been an absolute joy. And we wanted to make sure that the archaeological work and the results of the work and how all this information that we brought together would be accessible to people, both to the congregation, to the townspeople, to visitors, and to scholars and people interested in churches. So the decision was made not to, well, we did produce a boring archive report that no one will ever read, and that is done. But we've also written a hopefully more interesting book using Shepstone's phrase of "your church newly built," describing all of the subject matter that I've been dealing with today, and that will be published very shortly in the next couple of months. So I hope that this talk has been of interest. I hope that it may have inspired you to visit Minchinhampton Church and see what it is there. And I just want to say thank you to the Society for asking me to talk, to Hugh and to Rachel, to all of my all the archaeologists who helped on the site and who have answered all of my queries, and to principally to the church and their churchwardens and everyone on the committees, and to the architect and all the team. So thank you very much. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Chiz. That was really, really interesting. I think you've given us a fascinating overview of the biography of a church, you know, like many parish churches that change over time, often with the fashions and that sort of thing. And just as a reminder to people, if you have a question, pop them into the chat box. Rachel will be picking any out that we get. But while you're doing that, I guess I'll just ask a question or so. What I wondered, you know, slightly tangential to your talk, is how has this sort of new information that you got from the archaeological work, is that feeding in any way into the reordering, or at least how the presentation, you know, of the new church will appear to people who use it?
I think there was a vision and there was a scheme which had been carefully developed before we actually started the archaeological work. A lot of the research happened with the statement of significance, which is a necessary part of the faculty process that you need for doing a reordering like this. So there was a great deal of work on that, and to be honest, that statement included a lot more research than most statements of significance do. So everyone was well aware of the history and of the fact that there had been more of the medieval church, obviously. But I think it's something that slowly has kind of come out. Certainly the collection of various memorials and monuments in the narthex is a really nice kind of little kind of, you know, museum of different monument types. I think people are reflecting on I think the church officers that reflect on the significance of the church more and have a greater understanding and therefore a greater appreciation. But in terms of direct kind of feed through from the findings to kind of physical stuff, other than, you know, we're hoping to do, you know, some interpretative type stuff, and some of the artifacts potentially to go on display.
No, that's interesting. And actually, to sort of kind of related to that, you mentioned the bell that's now back in the church, which I think, is there a little potted history of where that bell moved around and then how it came back to the church? Or
yeah, there's some details. There was a local landowner, well, a couple of the family, the Plain family, wrote a book called Minchinhampton and Avening, which is an excellent resource, albeit a secondary resource. And he describes that this bell and it ended up in, it moved to the market house. Minchinhampton had 3 market houses, 2 of which have been demolished, and 1 of which is still there in the middle, in the side of the marketplace. And the bell was moved. Presumably, the bell was disposed of at the Reformation, and it was salvaged and moved to one of the market houses, and then it went to, I think, Longford's, which is one of the houses in town, and then in the 20th century it came back to the church. So there's interesting, tantalising clues about Catholic items being potentially hidden, and then coming back into use. There are some payments to a Sir Roger for various items, as if they may have been, you know, liturgical items which have been put in safekeeping. It does seem that the town stayed fairly Catholic for quite some time in its leanings. But the
No,
bell,
that's really fascinating. I think that's one of the more interesting aspects of the Reformation as well. That sort of retention of material culture. And you know, a little statue of Mary you can quite easily hide under the stairs, but a big bell is something else, which is kind of interesting. Anyway, this is not about me asking questions. Rachel, have we got any questions from our viewers?
Yes, we do. I mean, we've got quite a few comments. Cheers about how fascinating talk, interesting talk. To which I'll add my own comments about. It's really, really good. Philip Lancaster, apologies for mangling your surname. I probably mangled it even further. Says, is there anything more you know about the mill owner who saved the south transept from the rebuilding, and in particular, what prompted his interest in conserving it?
Right. Yes, there is. That was one of the great things about this has been it has been a veritable rabbit warren of little things to disappear down doing research, because you never know when researching into something will throw up something quite tangential which feeds back into it. From memory, the mill owner was, I think his name was Dalton. And I believe he was a member of I think he was in the Society of Antiquaries, and we do know quite a bit about him, but not. I think he just understood. I mean, it's a very interesting time in the period in the people's understanding of church buildings and church architects, isn't it? In kind of the late 1830s, early 1840s. We've got all the start of what would become the Gothic revival. We've got all these ideas of medievalism, kind of nascent medievalism. Could Dalton have been more in touch with those schools of thought and ecclesiologists than Ricardo, who was, I mean, David Ricardo Senior was a Sephardic Jew who converted to Christianity. So there's lots of things where we kind of try and go a little bit deeper into trying to understand the motives behind people. It's very difficult to understand those motives, but yeah, fascinating to try and find out more.
Many thanks.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks, Chiz. Alex McLean asks, are the medieval cross slabs still around, or are they only present in antiquarian illustrations?
Both. Hello, Alex. I thought you might be interested in those. There are, so this is another rabbit hole that I went down. I'm particularly interested in cross slabs. I'm meant to be doing a survey of Gloucestershire ones, which has got slightly waylaid. The cross slabs were largely collected during the demolition of the nave, and they were recorded and drawn, and then they were placed where they could be taken by anyone who wanted them. And there are several cross slabs still at the church. I think 3 or 4 of them are mounted in the narthex for everyone to see. There are 2 or 3 that I know of in the town, in buildings, set into buildings. There are almost certainly more that I'm not aware of. But my favourite one is a cross slab which ended up in Stonehouse, which is probably about 6 miles away, down a very steep hill, and then probably along the canal. And it ended up in Stonehouse Manor. And within, I think, 10 years, by the 1850s, there was a legend when someone went to visit Stonehouse Manor and asked what this cross slab was, they were told by a local, probably on the wind up, that it was the gravestone of Thomas Cromwell's horse. So he's either winding up someone come down from that London asking questions about all these old stones. Also, all within 10 years, people just didn't know what it was, and this whole kind of story had come up. So there are more cross slabs out there, I am sure, and I'm hoping that more will come to light. So there were about 40 found, I think, originally, and I think we've got about 6 or 7 left.
Wow, a quest for the missing cross slabs. That sounds like quite a task in itself. Just one more, Chiz. I'm aware that kind of time's marching on. I think you may have actually mentioned this in passing already, but Sue Evans asked, will there be new interpretation within the church at the end of the project? It's like panels, exhibition, that sort of thing.
I hope there could be something, but that's for discussion, really, and seeing how it works. There's been kind of we've been thinking about it, but it's I mean, there will be the book, which will be available soon, and there is a small guide as well. But designing panels is not an easy thing to do, but yeah, it's something that I'd certainly be keen to be involved with.
Right, well, fantastic. Thank you very much, Chiz. I think we passed our allotted time, so
Sorry.
No. Oh, that's nothing to do with you. It's partly we started slightly late as well, and also we've had lots of exciting questions. So, but I will draw it to a close first by thanking you again for a really interesting talk. And certainly if anyone's down in that part of the world, they should definitely go and visit. If for no other reason than that fantastic window, which is absolutely glorious. Just before we go, I'd just like to highlight to all those who are watching that we have our next talk planned on the 11th of March, again at the same time of 7 p.m. And our next speaker will be George Nash from Liverpool, who's going to talk about his work, and I'm going to mangle this, I know, on Llangwin Island on Ynys Môn in Wales, presumably. So please do keep an eye out for more information about that, and hopefully you can join us soon. But in the meantime, thank you, our speaker. Thank you all for attending, and I hope to see you very soon again. Good night.